Hello everyone, welcome back to the Velvet Murmurs.
Miss Marple and the Whispers Behind the Wallpaper. Chapter 1. The Storm over East Willows. It was the kind of evening that seemed to breathe secrets. The storm had begun just after dusk, rolling in from the north with a hush that grew into an indignant roar. Rain lashed the narrow country roads, obscuring hedgerows and signposts, and the winding drive to East Willows Manor, now converted into a modest guest house, had become a ribbon of mud and flickering puddles. Miss Marple, bundled in her travelling coat and clutching a folded umbrella, peered out from the window of the taxi as it juddered to a halt outside the grand but slightly lopsided house. The chimneys looked as though they leaned forward to eavesdrop. A flicker of lightning revealed ivy clawing its way across the south-facing wing, and one shutter banging against the sill with unceremonious insistence. "I dare say we've arrived," she murmured with faint irony. Beside her, Mrs. Dolly Bantry gave a theatrical shiver. "If we're not murdered in our beds tonight, it'll be a miracle." The front door was opened before they could knock, casting a warm lantern glow across the stone porch. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair stood in the frame, her expression unreadable. "Miss Marple? Mrs. Bantry? Welcome to East Willows. Do come in before the wind takes you." Miss Marple stepped into the hall with a grateful sigh. The scent of beeswax polish mingled with old plaster. A grandfather clock ticked solemnly near the stairs. A large oil painting dominated the wall, a sombre girl holding a sprig of something leafy, eyes turned to something beyond the viewer. It seemed out of place among the cheerful floral wallpaper and recent renovations. "I'm Clover Hartley," the woman said, "owner, hostess, and reluctant storm watcher." "You keep a beautiful house," Miss Marple offered kindly, though her eyes lingered a second longer on the crooked frame of the portrait. "The bones are old," Clover said, "some of them better left buried." It was the kind of remark Miss Marple remembered. They were shown to their rooms, airy spaces on the first floor, furnished with lavender sachets, embroidered bedspreads, and curiously, brand new wallpaper that peeled slightly in the corners, as though rejecting its place in history. "I do apologize for the damp," Clover added. "Room 3 especially is temperamental. The chimney draws badly and sometimes the plaster flakes." Miss Marple raised a brow. "How very particular of it." Downstairs, supper was served in the drawing room. Soup, poached fish, and apple tart. The other guests trickled in as thunder growled distantly behind the walls. There was young Nina Ashcroft, flushed and laughing nervously, her husband Paul in a stiff-collared shirt that looked like it hadn't been unpacked long. Reverend Bell arrived late, his umbrella dripping and his spectacles misted, mumbling apologies as he accepted a glass of sherry. And then there was the librarian, Agnes Winter, who entered quietly with a notebook clutched against her cardigan like a shield. She nodded a polite greeting, barely lifting her eyes. She said very little over dinner and declined dessert. "Migraines," she said, almost inaudibly. But Miss Marple had noticed something. Agnes had no luggage, not even a coat. Just a small handbag and that notebook. Later that evening, as lightning etched bone-white streaks across the sky and wind howled through the chimney flues, Miss Marple stood at the upstairs landing, staring down the corridor. The wallpaper rippled slightly as if breathing. A door creaked. Room 3. Agnes Winter stepped into the hallway in her nightdress. She turned, looked over her shoulder, and whispered something to the dark. Then she retreated back inside and closed the door. The next morning, she was gone. No note, no signs of forced entry. Her bed had not been slept in. The window was closed from the inside. Her notebook remained on the dressing table, untouched. And just beneath the candle sconce, where the wallpaper curled like the edge of a forgotten page, a thin slit revealed something strange beneath the surface. Scrawled into the plaster in jagged strokes were the words, "She saw what she shouldn't, she won't speak again." Miss Marple, who had been sipping her tea quietly beside the staircase, looked up at the sound of the housekeeper's scream. Then she rose, smoothed her skirt, and said to herself, very softly, "How very inconvenient." But then again, truth has a way of seeping through walls. Chapter 2. The Unopened Letter and the Whispering Garden. The disappearance of Miss Agnes Winter set the household humming by mid-morning. Clover Hartley, her face drained of colour but her voice unwavering, stood at the head of the breakfast table, explaining that Miss Winter must have left early, perhaps called away urgently, though she said nothing to me last night. "She didn't say a word to me either," said Reverend Bell, buttering his toast with excessive pressure. "But I did hear footsteps on the stairs just before midnight. I assumed it was the wind whistling under the door." "Wind doesn't wear slippers," muttered Mrs. Bantry, leaning in toward Miss Marple. Miss Marple, who had hardly touched her soft-boiled egg, sat unusually still. Her gaze was not on Clover or the half-eaten marmalade toast, but on the crack along the skirting board beneath the bay window, where muddy water pooled into a thin line, as though someone had come in or gone out. She dabbed her lips with her napkin. "I should like to see room 3, if that's not too inconvenient," she said mildly. "It's always best to tidy while the air is still warm." Clover hesitated. "Of course. I'll fetch the key." Room 3 was chilly, despite the morning sun angling across the floor in fractured stripes. The window was tightly latched and the hearth untouched. A faint, sweet smell lingered, not of perfume, but pressed violets. Something clung to the corners of the room. Not dust, memory. Miss Marple moved gently, her fingers brushing the dressing table. The notebook remained closed. On its cover was a tiny embossed stamp, City of Westminster Public Libraries. Inside, the pages were blank, except for one. There's more written under paint than in print. She paused. A curious phrase. Not one an ordinary librarian would use unless she were reading into walls instead of books. Mrs. Bantry let out a soft exclamation near the fireplace. "What is it, dear?" "I don't know," Dolly murmured. "There's something odd here. Look." She gestured to a yellowed envelope stuck behind the dressing mirror, half torn. The flap was sealed with an old-fashioned red wax stamp, a stylized W pressed into it. Miss Marple took it with great care. It was brittle with age, unopened, addressed only as, "For her who remembers the garden." They exchanged a glance. "I don't suppose we ought to open it," said Dolly, half hoping the opposite. "I think we mustn't yet," said Miss Marple. "But we ought to find out who planted it here and who was meant to read it. Letters can be as dangerous as guns when placed in the wrong hands." Outside, a light breeze stirred the hedges. From the rear windows, the garden stretched wild and half-tamed, wisteria climbing a broken trellis, thyme growing over flagstones, and a strange stone circle tucked behind tangled rose bushes, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. That afternoon, while others occupied themselves with reading or resting, Miss Marple made her way to the back garden. The path was uneven, covered in moss, and little used. She paused at the circle, 5 flat dark stones, waist-high, arranged around a central sundial. Something about it pricked at her memory. Not from gardening, but folklore. She bent to examine the centerpiece, brushing away leaves. Beneath the sundial was an engraving, long eroded. "Where vows are buried, roots shall rise." Miss Marple straightened slowly. "Vows," she whispered. "Not bodies, but perhaps both." A rustle behind the trellis startled her. A man stood there, silent as a tree, his eyes milky white. It was the gardener, Leo. "You see it too," he said, voice like gravel dragged across stone. She asked questions, so did the other one before her, the one who used to pick bluebells by moonlight. Miss Marple approached him gently. "Miss Winter?" He shook his head once. "Number, not her. The girl before. 20 years gone now. She vanished too, but not in a storm." "Did anyone ever find her?" "They found her ribbon in the fireplace ash," he said with certainty. "And her voice, sometimes, when the wallpaper peels back too far. That evening, As dusk fell and the guests retired early, perhaps unsettled by the lingering talk of the storm and Miss Winter's absence, Miss Marple sat by the fireplace with her knitting, though she barely moved her needles. Inspector Tolliver had arrived by then, summoned by Clover Hartley, though she clearly regretted it. He was a square-shouldered man with a square temper to match. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, glancing up from his notes, "you've got quite the reputation. Any reason to think this is anything more than a case of a lonely woman leaving quietly in the night?" Miss Marple smiled. "No reason at all, Inspector, except that lonely women don't usually scratch cryptic messages into plaster, abandon notebooks full of metaphors, or leave letters for unnamed ghosts in the mirror." Tolliver blinked. "And you'd be surprised," she added, "how often the past leaves roots even when the garden's been redone." Chapter 3. The Room That Changed Its Shape. It was just past 8 o'clock the following morning when Miss Marple asked for a cup of weak Darjeeling and the original blueprints of the house. Clover Hartley blinked at her over the breakfast tray. "I beg your pardon?" "The architectural plans," said Miss Marple, sweetly. "You mentioned to Mrs. Bantry on our first evening that the manor had been refurbished extensively. I find house plans rather soothing, don't you? Like knitting patterns, though the stitches are doors and windows." Clover hesitated, then gave a thin smile. "I suppose I can have them fetched from the bureau, but they're terribly dusty." "I do hope so," Miss Marple replied, eyes twinkling. The plans arrived mid-morning, rolled tightly and tied with silk ribbon. Miss Marple unrolled them on the sitting-room table while Mrs. Bantry peered over her shoulder, already impatient. "There's the east wing," Miss Marple murmured, pointing with her knitting needle. 3 bedrooms along the corridor, rooms 2, 3 and 4. But look here, on the 1901 blueprint. The hallway was longer. Much longer. Room 3, where Agnes Winter had been staying, was not meant to be the last room before the linen closet. There had once been a 4th bedroom, room 5, connected to the others by a narrow servants' corridor, now missing from the modern layout. Mrs. Bantry straightened, brows raised. "Someone's bricked it in." Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver from the page, or concealed it, which is rather curious, don't you think, especially if one were trying to hide more than just plaster cracks and faulty wiring. They went upstairs after lunch, ostensibly to check the wardrobe hinges, as Miss Marple explained to the hovering housemaid. The hallway was papered in cheerful cabbage roses now, freshly applied, but Miss Marple could see the subtle bulge in the wall across from room 3. It was a shallow curve, almost elegant, unless you knew that it ought to have been a right angle. She tapped the wall once, twice. Hollow. "Do you recall," she said softly to Mrs. Bantry, "how Agnes Winter stepped into the corridor that night and whispered something?" Mrs. Bantry nodded. "What if," said Miss Marple, "she was speaking to someone inside the wall?" They descended in silence, only to find the Reverend waiting for them at the foot of the stairs, clasping his hat and looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to intrude," he began, "but something rather strange occurred in the chapel this morning." "The chapel?" asked Miss Marple. "Just across the orchard. We've used it for local services since before the war. It's half ruined now, but this morning I found something in the pulpit drawer, a letter, with the same wax seal as the one you found behind the mirror." Miss Marple's face remained impassive. "You opened it, I presume?" "I did," he admitted. "It's nonsense, really. A list of names, some crossed out, others underlined in red." Miss Marple extended her hand. "May I?" He produced it, a thin, brittle sheet, written in looping cursive. "Catherine, refused the oath Mabel, broken Agnes, awake Francine, loyal, for now, Rosemary, buried L, silent always Clara, sings in sleep." Dolly Bantry let out a low breath. "That's not nonsense, that's a list of victims. No dates, no locations, but enough," Miss Marple murmured. She turned back to the Reverend. "Tell me, Have you ever heard of a local society of women who used to gather here? Not a church group exactly, something older. Herbalists, perhaps, or keepers of what one might call domestic knowledge? He blinked. There's a legend about a group called the Thorn Circle, if that's what you mean. Women who protected other women during the war, gave shelter, helped with, well, you know, things not everyone agreed with. Miss Marple nodded. And if one of them had later betrayed the others? Agnes Winter was asking about them, he confessed. She asked if the chapel had a burial register from 1945. I thought it odd. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. There's a secret in this house, she said, buried behind a wall, painted over again and again, not just with plaster, but with silence. That evening, a new sound filled the house. At first, it seemed like wind moaning through the eaves, but as the night deepened, the guests began to stir. Reverend Bell came out into the corridor with a lantern. Nina and Paul Ashcroft stood at the top of the stairs in their dressing gowns, clutching one another. A low, rhythmic tapping from inside the wall near room 3. Paul stepped forward. Mice, surely? No, said Nina, suddenly pale. It's too slow, too human. The tapping stopped, and then a woman's voice, faint, muffled, pleading, a single word, help! Mrs. Bantry screamed. Inspector Tolliver was summoned again, his boots muddy from the chapel walk and his face grim. I'll have a man break the wall tomorrow, he said flatly. Miss Marple looked at the wallpaper with its faded roses. I should do it tonight, she replied softly. Because sometimes, Inspector, the dead are patient, but the living are not. Chapter 4. What lies behind the wall? They began at dawn. Inspector Tolliver, shovel in hand, called in a local workman named Blake Fenchurch, a man of few words and thick wrists, to assist with the demolition. The section of wall between room 3 and the old linen cupboard had been cleared of furniture and stripped of its decorative roses. Only pale plaster remained now, with faint outlines of old hooks and a hidden doorway that time had half swallowed. Miss Marple stood in the hallway wrapped in a shawl with her knitting forgotten in her bag. The other guests lingered at a respectful distance, hushed and wary. With the first strike of the chisel, dust bloomed like breath in winter. Bit by bit the wall gave way, not easily, as if reluctant to release its secrets. A hollow echoed behind each blow, confirming what Miss Marple had already suspected. There was a hidden room, and soon the truth was exposed. Behind the crumbling plaster and bricks was a narrow chamber, no wider than a cupboard, but tall enough to stand in. The air that came out was bitter and old, laced with mildew and something faintly floral. Dried lavender, perhaps, long dead. Inside, a small wooden cot stood against the far wall, broken at one corner. Beside it, a child's chair toppled, a moth-eaten blanket, an ancient tin of barley sweets, and on the peeling wall behind it, scratched into the plaster, she was never meant to be born. Mrs. Bantry gasped. What? What is this place? The inspector muttered. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. Her eyes were not on the cot or the decaying furniture, but on a large trunk tucked into the corner, partly covered by a mould-stained cloth. Careful, she said softly. The inspector heaved it open. Inside were parchment-bound books, loose papers, and what appeared to be a midwife's satchel, a rusted pair of surgical scissors, a tattered prayer book, and dozens of birth certificates, many of them incomplete or crossed out with red ink. At the very bottom, a faded photograph. Women standing in the chapel garden in a tight circle. Their faces blurred, but one detail stood out. Each woman wore a rose-shaped pin at her collar. Miss Marple took a sharp breath. "The Thorn Circle," she whispered. Inspector Tolliver looked at her sharply. "You're saying this was some kind of cult?" "No," she said firmly. "A sanctuary. Or it began that way, but secrets decay like flesh when kept too long in the dark." Later that day, while the inspector sorted through the evidence with a growing sense of unease, Miss Marple walked the orchard path alone, past the chapel and toward the old gardener's shed. Leo was inside, polishing a broken sundial. "She's not the first to go missing," he said, as if continuing a conversation they'd already begun. "No," Miss Marple replied, "but she might be the first to leave clues behind on purpose." Leo nodded slowly. "There were 3 rooms hidden once. This is the last." Miss Marple studied him. "And you've always known?" "Not everything," he said, "but enough to keep quiet. Clover wasn't born Hartley, you know." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Go on. She was one of them. The girls born in this house, one of the silent ones. But she came back, bought it after the war, said she wanted to restore it to dignity. Some say she just wanted to control the past, put the ghosts in tidy drawers." "And Agnes?" Miss Marple asked. Leo's face darkened. Agnes found the birth ledger, saw names that shouldn't exist, and one that should have, hers. You see, Agnes wasn't from London. She was born right here, buried on paper before she could walk. Miss Marple's mind reeled. "That letter she left behind the mirror, it wasn't a confession," she murmured. "It was a message for someone like her, for the next girl." That evening, as guests sat in the drawing room in silence, Miss Marple asked quietly, "Clover, may I see your hands?" The woman frowned. "My hands?" "Yes, dear. You see, I noticed yesterday that you wear gloves in the garden, even when it's not cold." Slowly, Clover removed them. Her palms were bandaged, burned. "The acid used to strip wallpaper," Miss Marple said. "It seeps, especially when you're in a hurry to cover up something scrawled beneath." Clover's eyes didn't meet hers. "She wasn't supposed to open that door." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But you did, long before she ever came here. You opened it first, as a girl. And what you saw frightened you so much that you spent your life pretending it hadn't happened." Tears brimmed in Clover's eyes, but her expression hardened. "She was going to tell," she said softly. "And if people knew what this house was built on, what it did to women, you silenced her." "I tried to frighten her," Clover said, voice shaking. "I painted over the wall, removed the ledger, moved her things, but she wouldn't stop asking. And then, that night she left her room. I followed. I don't even remember what I said."
"And did she leave the house?" "No," Clover whispered. "She's still here. But I didn't kill her. She's hiding. Somewhere. I swear it." Miss Marple turned to Inspector Tolliver. "She's telling the truth," she said. "Clover may have covered it all up, but I believe Agnes is still alive because someone has been leaving messages in the chapel, and because the postmistress reports a telegram received just 2 days ago from London." "From Agnes?" the inspector asked. "No," Miss Marple said. "From someone using her birth name, the one crossed out in the ledger, Rosemary W." "Then who's Rosemary?" Tolliver asked. And Miss Marple answered, in a quiet, trembling voice, "The girl who sings in sleep."
Chapter 5. The Name in the Firelight. The house was quiet that evening. Too quiet for a place that had, just hours earlier, revealed a hidden chamber behind its walls. Guests tiptoed around, whispering over tea, as though afraid the house might overhear them. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her hands folded in her lap, eyes half closed, but mind sharply alert. Across from her, Clover Hartley sat in silence, her bandaged hands motionless. There was something in her expression, not guilt exactly. More like exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes from carrying a secret one no longer believes can stay buried. "The girl who sings in sleep," Miss Marple repeated almost to herself. "Tell me, Clover, do you know a lullaby that begins with the words, 'Willow by water, hush thee to sleep'?" Clover's eyes lifted sharply. That was sung to us. By the matron. I hadn't thought of it in years." "I believe it's the key," Miss Marple said gently. Later that night, when the rest of the house had gone to bed, Miss Marple took her shawl and stepped out into the corridor, candle in hand. The air was heavy with damp and old wallpaper paste, and the storm had begun to whisper again through the eaves. She made her way down the back staircase, through the service corridor, the one she now suspected was never truly sealed, and into the old nursery wing, now used only for storage. The rooms were empty, bare boards exposed, and dust swirling in the candlelight. She began to hum. "Willow by water, hush thee to sleep. The garden shall keep thee, the thorns shall not weep." At first, nothing happened. But then, from behind a tall linen press, a muffled note, high and thin like a bird startled from its nest. Miss Marple moved slowly, carefully shifting the wooden press aside. Behind it, an old servant's door, stained, unlocked. She opened it. Inside was a crawl space, barely lit by a sliver of moonlight from a high, cobwebbed window. The air was thick, warm, and smelled of lavender and fear. And there, curled under a moth-eaten blanket, was Agnes Winter. She blinked slowly, eyes sunken but alive. Her voice was a rasp. "You remembered the song?" Miss Marple knelt beside her. "Yes, dear," she whispered. "And now it's time you came out." They carried Agnes gently down to the parlour. She was trembling, her skin pale as smoke, but she managed to speak between sips of water. "She followed me that night. Clover, I opened the old cupboard and found the ledger. I saw my name, not as Agnes, but as Rosemary Winther. I realized my adoptive parents had lied. I was born here. My mother had been one of the girls in the circle. They must have hidden me. But when I asked Clover, she told me to stop. That digging into the past would only bring pain." She looked up at Miss Marple. I think she was scared. I don't think she meant to hurt me, but I was scared too, so I hid. I knew the old nursery corridor still existed. I followed the pattern in the wallpaper, that little blue butterfly. It always led to a door. Inspector Tolliver stood near the hearth, looking as if he'd swallowed a nail. "And the thorn circle?" he asked. "What were they protecting?" Agnes's eyes shifted. "Unwanted girls, pregnant women, wives with bruises. They took them in, helped them disappear, or start again. Some were adopted, some went abroad, but the church, the fathers, they didn't like it, so the circle was broken. Some betrayed the rest." "And the woman behind the wall?" Miss Marple asked softly. "The child's room." The cot Agnes hesitated. "I think that was for her child, the one the circle couldn't save. There were whispers about a girl named Clara. She refused to give the baby up. Then one night, she vanished. Only the cot was left." Silence fell. Then Miss Marple reached into her bag and removed the letter, the one marked, "For her who remembers the garden." She handed it to Agnes. "Would you like to read it?" With trembling hands, Agnes broke the seal. Her eyes scanned the page. Then she smiled through tears. "It's from my mother. She wrote it when she knew she wouldn't live through the delivery. It says, 'Your name is Rosemary. You are not a mistake. You are not shame. You are love, planted deep, and the garden remembers you.'" Tears fell freely now, from Agnes, from Clover, from even the stoic inspector. Only Miss Marple remained dry-eyed, but her heart ached. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the truth isn't about guilt. It's about giving the dead their names back, and letting the living stop hiding." Chapter 6. The Roots Beneath East Willows. The morning after Agnes Winter was found, the house was quieter than it had been in days, not with calm, but with a kind of expectant silence. The sort of hush that settles before something is unearthed. Miss Marple, wrapped in her softest shawl and fortified by a cup of well-brewed tea, requested to visit the village parish office. "I always find," she told Inspector Tolliver, as they waited for the vicar to unlock the records room, "that the dead are very good at telling stories, as long as someone bothers to read them." The Reverend was apologetic. "We lost a great many records during the flood of 46, he said, leading them into the cramped archives. "But some of the old ledgers remain, births, banns, burials. There's even a register from the East Willows Orphans Guild, if that's any use." "Oh yes," said Miss Marple. "I believe it may be the most useful of all." For nearly an hour she sat hunched at the small wooden desk, thumbing through delicate yellowed pages that smelled faintly of damp and linseed oil. She found Clara Ashcroft first. A brief entry in the register. Clara Ashcroft, admitted May, 1945, 7 months with child, no family listed, resided 8 weeks, then, with a red-inked line, departed unaccompanied, status unresolved. Beside the name, a faded symbol had been stamped, a thorny rose, the mark of the circle. She continued, names repeated, some vanished, some reappeared years later under new surnames. And then she found the one that made her fingers pause. Rosemary Winther, born August 14th, 1945. Mother, Clara Ashcroft, deceased, August 14th, 1945, postpartum. Guardian, matron, Eleanor Hartley. Miss Marple stared at the name, Hartley. She reached for another book, the marriage register, and flipped to the year 1965. There it was. Clover Eleanor Hartley, married Paul Ashcroft. Her eyes narrowed. She turned to Inspector Tolliver. "You recall the honeymoon couple staying in room 5? Nina and Paul Ashcroft? Yes, Paul is Clara's nephew." "But that would mean—" Miss Marple closed the book with a soft thud. "Paul Ashcroft is Agnes Winter's cousin, and her name, Rosemary, was scrubbed from this village for a reason." Back at the manor, Clover Hartley was in the greenhouse, pruning dead blossoms from her orchids. When Miss Marple approached, she did not look up. "I always suspected," Clover said softly. "About Paul, I saw his application for tenancy, the name, the way he looked at the chapel." "You invited him anyway?" "I had to know, whether it was all over, whether they remembered." "And Agnes?" Clover hesitated, then sighed. "I tried to keep her safe, I truly did. But when she started asking questions about Clara, about the name scratched into the nursery cot, I panicked. She thought she was investigating her own murder," Miss Marple said gently. "But in truth she was unearthing Clara's." Clover turned. "I didn't kill Clara, that was someone else." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Who?" Clover opened her mouth, then closed it. She turned away. "She went to the chapel," she said after a pause. "Alone, after she gave birth. Someone met her there. Someone she trusted. And she never came back. Do you know who it was?" "I've always suspected, but I never proved it." "And now?" Clover looked up, eyes glistening. "Now I think I must stop pretending it was long ago and too late." That evening, Miss Marple knocked gently on room 5. Nina Ashcroft answered, pale and startled. "I'd like to speak with your husband," Miss Marple said. Paul came to the doorway moments later, folding his sleeves. "Yes, Miss Marple? Do you know the name Clara Ashcroft?" He hesitated, just for a second, then smiled politely. "An ancestor, I think. Why?" Miss Marple studied him with steady eyes. "She was your aunt, and Agnes Winter is your cousin, both born in this house. One was erased, the other nearly disappeared." Paul's smile thinned. "You seem to know a lot about my family, Miss Marple." "I do," she replied. "But what I'm still trying to understand is this. Who burned the adoption records? Who crossed out Rosemary's name in the ledger? And why did a telegram in her name arrive from London when she was still hiding inside your family home?" His face paled. "I've no idea what you mean." "I think you do, and I think it's time you told Agnes the truth, or she may never believe her life belongs to her again." That night, Miss Marple sat beside Agnes in the parlour once more. The young woman was staring into the fire, fingers clutching the old letter from her mother. "I feel as though I've been stitched together with lies," she whispered. "No," said Miss Marple, gently taking her hand. "You've been stitched through with love. Badly at times, yes, and clumsily, but not without reason, and not without hope." Agnes turned to her, tearfully. "But what do I do now?" Miss Marple smiled. "You plant your name back into the soil, and you let it grow. Chapter 7. The Garden in the Rain. Rain fell steadily that morning, soaking the garden paths and pooling in the grooves of the old stone circle. It was the sort of rain that made the earth soft, soft enough to release what it had once agreed to keep. Agnes stood beneath the crooked cherry tree, a shawl pulled over her head, her hands muddy from kneeling. Miss Marple watched from the greenhouse as she traced the worn edges of a low, weathered gravestone just beyond the trellis. The inscription had almost vanished, but not completely. Clara Ashcroft, 1925 to 1945. The thorn protects, the garden remembers. It was not an official grave. There was no parish record, no funeral entry. It was marked in circle script. Symbols and phrasing passed between the women who had built East Willows into sanctuary and silence. Agnes looked up. Her face was calm, but something in her expression had hardened. "I know now," she said, "why no one spoke her name." Miss Marple moved beside her. "Some kept it buried out of guilt, others out of fear, but a few, dear, may have been trying to protect you." Agnes shook her head slowly. "Not Paul, he knew. He's the one who sent the telegram from London. He was checking if I remembered who I was, if I would speak." "You're sure?" Miss Marple asked gently. Agnes nodded. "He called me Rosemary once, quietly, when he thought I was half asleep. I'd only ever told Clover my real name." Miss Marple placed a hand on her arm. "Then it's time." They returned to the manor, sodden and silent. Paul Ashcroft was seated in the parlour, reading a newspaper he wasn't actually reading. Agnes stepped into the room, still in her garden coat, and sat across from him. Her voice, when it came, was low but firm. "You've known who I am all along." He didn't look up. "I didn't know you were her," he said softly. "Not until I saw your face properly. There's a photo of Clara. You have her eyes. You sent the telegram."
"Yes. Why?" Paul finally looked up. His face had changed, not cruel, but distant. "Because I needed to know if you would start digging, if you would ruin everything they built." "They built protection," Agnes said. "You helped bury it." "I helped cover a mistake. Clara should never have kept you. The circle fell apart because of her, because she wouldn't follow the plan. She was warned." "She was murdered," Agnes said coldly. Paul said nothing. Miss Marple, who had been listening from the corridor, stepped in. "You know, Mr. Ashcroft, I've always found it curious that your wife, Nina, never knew your full family history. You told her your parents died young, that you were raised in foster care, and yet you seem to have a rather intimate knowledge of Clara's life and of Rosemary's birth." Paul's eyes darkened. "Stop," he said. Miss Marple didn't. Her tone remained kindly, as if offering gardening advice. "You burned the records when you realized Agnes had found the ledger, and you staged her disappearance, hoping Clover would panic, hoping she'd confess and take the blame. She did panic."
"But she never harmed Agnes," Miss Marple said. "You did that. You drugged her tea, left the door open, planted the scratched message in the plaster. It was all meant to suggest madness or suicide." "She wanted the truth," Paul said. "She would have destroyed everything. The memory of the circle, the safety my aunt tried so hard to preserve." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. "Sometimes, dear boy, protection is just fear dressed in softer clothes, and fear, left unchecked, becomes cruelty." Agnes stood. "I'm not a mistake. I'm not shame. I'm not a name scratched out in red ink." Paul rose, but Inspector Tolliver had already entered through the back door. "We'll take it from here," the inspector said grimly. That afternoon the rain stopped. The air smelled of wet stone and new roots. In the old garden, a small ceremony took place. A rose bush was planted beside Clara's hidden grave, one with soft pink petals and a thorny spine. The vicar said no words, only bowed his head. The rest stood in silence. Agnes stood with Miss Marple afterward, watching the rainwater drip from the hedges. "You were right," she said quietly. The truth does grow once you let it breathe. Miss Marple smiled. All things do if you're patient. They turned back to the house, leaving behind the garden that no longer whispered secrets, only remembrance. Chapter 8. The drawing room and the final letter. The rain had lifted entirely by morning. The sky hung washed and pale, the earth smelling of moss and old wood, as if something long buried had finally exhaled. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, knitting at last. The fire crackled gently, the only sound in a room once filled with unsaid things. Across from her sat Inspector Tolliver, his notebook closed, pen tucked neatly into his coat. "You never quite stop, do you?" he said, gesturing to the needles. "I find it helps the mind," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Stitches are like people. One dropped, and it spoils the pattern." He gave a reluctant smile. "And the pattern here, Miss Marple? Would you mind laying it out for me? I know the facts, but not all the whys." Miss Marple nodded. "Let's begin not with murder, but with fear. Fear that began 80 years ago when the women of East Willows formed the Thorn Circle. They were midwives? And more, she said. Protectors of the shamed, the beaten, the unspoken, the ones society would rather forget. They delivered babies who were never named, hid mothers from cruel husbands, forged adoption records, yes, but for mercy, not profit. Until Clara Ashcroft. Miss Marple paused in her knitting. Clara was the first to say no. She wanted to keep her child. She was told not to. A threat was made, not by the circle, but by a man who had infiltrated it. A sponsor, they called him. He helped finance the manor's upkeep. And silence. Tolliver's brow furrowed. "Paul Ashcroft?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "His father, the original Mr. Ashcroft. He made the deal to hide Clara. She trusted him. But when she insisted on naming the child, on baptizing her Rosemary, she vanished. Clara was killed." Miss Marple nodded. "Buried quietly, the cot bricked into the wall, and Rosemary was registered under a false name, adopted out. But something went wrong. The paperwork was never completed. The circle dissolved, and the girl disappeared into the system." Agnes Winter. "Who came back as a librarian," Miss Marple said, not realizing the very house she'd chosen to stay in was her birthplace. Tolliver exhaled. "And Clover Hartley?" "She was once one of the rescued girls," Miss Marple replied. "Given the house later in life, after the war, to rebuild it as a home for guests, not secrets. But she kept some of the silence alive, out of guilt, out of loyalty, perhaps even fear." "And Paul?" Miss Marple looked toward the window. "He found out who Agnes was, saw the circle's secrets in her, feared exposure. And instead of doing what was right, he chose the old path, silence, intimidation, erasure. He tried to scare her into vanishing, but Agnes is her mother's daughter. She remembered the garden." There was a long pause. "And justice?" Tolliver asked. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Not always the kind that fits neatly into ledgers, but yes, the truth came out. The wrong person didn't go to prison, and the right person finally heard her mother's voice. Later that day, as the sun pushed through the orchard branches, Clover Hartley found a letter in the postbox. It bore no stamp, only her name, written in strong, looping hand. Inside was a single sheet, a note. Old, ink faded, but unmistakable. "Clover, if she ever comes back, do not fear her. Fear what will happen if she doesn't. Eleanor." It was from the old matron. Clover sat in the garden for a long time, the note trembling in her hands. And for the first time in decades, she cried. Not out of fear or shame, but release. That evening, Miss Marple and Dolly Bantry prepared to leave East Willows. The taxi waited at the front gate, the village sun slanting golden across the gravel drive. Agnes stood beside the car, holding a notebook, the same one she'd clutched on her first night. But now it was filled. "Thank you," she said softly to Miss Marple, "for not treating me like a ghost." Miss Marple took her hand and smiled. "Dear girl, ghosts only linger when the living won't speak. but you did. And now the house will rest." As the car pulled away, Miss Marple looked back one last time. The manor stood quiet, the garden lush, and in the far corner, beneath the rosebush they had planted, a breeze stirred the leaves. It did not whisper any more, it remembered.